Welcome to our new MPI MMG in Dialogue event. This is the first in a series of events that will offer discussions of new research, challenging concepts and novel developments in the broad field of migration and social cultural difference. MPI MMG, you may have wondered, it's the acronym for, as you can see here, Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, or if you want to know where the MMG comes from, it's the German Max Planck Institut zur Erforschung multireligiöser und multiethnischer Gesellschaften. Our dialogue today is entitled Migration Studies Without the Nation State, ? And the title, I think maybe provocatively, summarizes what Adrian Favell, our guest today, proposes in a new book he will publish in a few months entitled The Integration Nation. And we have the privilege to learn about this, as usual, provocative critique of migration studies and a proposed alternative in advance of the actual book publication. Adrian is now a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, which made travel here easier. Normally he holds a chair in sociology and social theory at the University of Leeds, where he is also the director of the Baumann Institute. Previously he was the director of a center and professor of European and International Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark, also professor of sociology at the University of California in Los Angeles, and a professor of sociology at Sciences Po, so widely traveled and wide experience of studies in the field. He has contributed to research and debates about immigrant integration. His philosophies of integration is widely cited, and migration within the European Union, and he has also published more generally on the sociology of the European Union, and surprising to me, about Japanese art also. But that's something we are not going to discuss today, I suppose. Christine Lang, our second guest, is now a researcher at the University of Osnabrück. We were quite sad when she left us a couple of months ago, having been a fellow at this institute for a few years. She's now a researcher at the Institute for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies, IMIS, and a member of the Geography Department of Osnabrück University. Her research focuses on municipal diversity policies and civil society in French and German cities. She has a degree from Paris and Freiburg, so this sound background in France, French studies. And her book in 2019 is entitled Die Produktion von Diversität in städtischen Verwaltungen. She was also involved in a large project on careers of second-generation immigrants, the Pathways to Success project. Last but not least, not a guest, but the host here, today as a panelist, the founding director of this institute, Stephen Vertovec. Steve came to Göttingen from Oxford, where he headed a research center, Compass, Center on Migration, Policy and Society, after having coordinated a large umbrella project on transnationalism. Steve is, of course, best known for introducing the concept of super diversity, but he has also published widely on transnational social formations, ethnic diasporas, and more recently on the organization of social differences. In 2007, he came to Göttingen to set up a Max Planck Institute that was not meant to continue common migration research, and I'm sure we will hear more about the plans and what turned out of them in the end later on. I'm maybe obviously not Sakura Yamamura, but had to replace her at short notice. My name is Karen Schönwälder. I'm a research group leader here at this institute. I will hand over to Adrian Favell for a short presentation. now, and after that we will discuss core issues first with a panel, but then also allow our small audience that we have here at the Institute to ask questions. This is, of course, due to current conditions that we have this smallish audience. We hope that in the spring we will also be able to invite you all out there to come to this splendid hall here, our library, and join future events in presence with us here. Now, if you're listening per video, you will also be able to ask questions and make short comments. Please use the chat function for that, and my colleague Farhan Samanani will help and read out your comments and questions later in the discussion. So, but now over to you, Adrian.
Well, hello to everybody. Thank you. Thanks to Karen for the introduction and to the Max Planck Institute here in Göttingen for the invitation. I wanted also to thank Steve for the kind words that are on the back of this book, The Integration Nation, that we'll get a glimpse of today. There's also a paper behind this, which is a paper for the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, which focuses on what I see as a kind of generational difference between the migration studies that really rose up during the 1990s, associated with organizations like IMISCO, journals like GEMS, or the North American canon that we're all familiar with in the study of immigration, and the very different kind of literature that we find now in the post-2008 era of crises, often by younger generation scholars in anthropology, the humanities, the critical ends of sociology and international studies, that have a much less optimistic view of immigration. The world that we're living in now is a very different one in terms of exclusions, racisms, neo-colonial formations, and a move away from the kind of more optimistic vision of immigration studies that used to be maybe out there. I'm part of the old generation, obviously, in some sense, but I do see myself maybe a bit like this, as an old school scientist working for the empire, who is nevertheless trying to plant a destructive theoretical code at the heart of the Death Star. And I do think that all of us as migration scholars, older and newer generations, are writing often from the heart of the Death Star, in some sense. But I'm interested in these guys. This is obviously Rogue One. This is the new generation, a motley crew of younger, diverse and more marginal feminist, queer and decolonial theorists who are trying to bring down the evil empire. They know what's right and wrong, and I substantially agree with them, but maybe they haven't yet worked out the full approach that's necessary to destroying this empire of thought that we're stuck in. And my proposition in the paper is basically to build a bridge between what I see as the compatible elements of an older literature rooted in scholarship that can be traced back to Ari Zolberg and scholars around him, a kind of neo-Weberian vision of migration and the nation state, and link it to the very strong Marxist Foucauldian currents in this younger and newer generation in terms of the study of what I call political demography. And I'm going to very rapidly go through these 5 points, and I hope that we'll have a chance to pick up on the details of this as we go through our discussion later. The Integration Nation is a critique of the still implicit and often explicit linear normative mode of thinking about immigration as a topic. It structures most research in our field, I say, and also nearly all applied political and policy debate. Now, this is obviously a persistent Westphalian conception of the territorial unified state, and it's one in which migration is no longer just an anomaly, but is actually at the heart of the way in which the state defines, preserves and reproduces its power, the way in which it kind of looks at immigration. And integration is at the heart of how these states generate power from international migration. Integration binds, bounds, and individuates citizens, but it's not integration really as the AfD imagine it. If you see the slide I had at the beginning, it's integration as modernization or modernity itself. It's the production of modern-day individuals in a multi-ethnic and possibly even a super diverse nation state. And this, I argue, is the source of the power of immigrant integration nations. The key move in my work, analytically is to always focus on the migration mobilities continuum and point out just how small a part of this immigration in fact is. Immigration, which we often focus on in migration studies, obviously is a way in which, a kind of issue around which states generate power by bordering populations, making them legible, but also it's about how states make populations invisible at the same time. Immigration, this is a familiar point from border studies, and a lot of migration studies focuses, particularly critical migration studies, focuses on processes by which states exclude, marginalize, or deport populations and keep them away from the nation. But my focus often is on the vastly larger numbers of unproblematic people on the move in a globally porous world. We need to kind of focus on both the visibility and the invisibility of different sorts of migrant populations. And immigrants in the heart of this are the ones that the state feels it can integrate. So integration defines citizenship, but it also defines immigration policy as such. Immigrants, in other words, are those who the state decides can be integrated. So integration, in a sense, defines the particular population that is able to move into the nation state and become new members of the nation state. Now, this process, as we know, over time has become increasingly selective and particular in its dynamics. Immigration nations want to select the best and the brightest, and this is an extractive dynamic, which is why it's also a neo-colonial dynamic often. The immigrants that the state sees as integratable are always those that it can move into the nation and select from the outside. It's also a strongly biopolitical dynamic. It's an emancipatory dynamic. Migrants are turned into citizens as part of this process of becoming immigrants, but at the same time differentiated from all the other populations that are either waste in this kind of international system or are simply invisible and able to move across borders without being subject to integration. The elites or the free-moving mobile populations that are also part of this picture. And I hope you can see how this kind of gets at the whole problematic of how integration nations categorize migrants and mobile populations in order to identify who are the good and the bad migrants, effectively, which is obviously a key point in critical migration studies. Now, getting to point 4 here, this paper, particularly the paper I've written for GEMS, focuses on the problematic, really, of open borders and humanitarian politics of migration. A lot of critical studies wants to defend an open borders position on forced migration, but I share the skepticism in my paper of Mirna Safi in her new book, Migration and Inequality, about the overwhelming focus in critical migration studies on humanitarian migration. Humanitarian migration is only a small part of overall international immigration as it's conceived by nation states, and we need to bring back into the picture an economic focus on migrants. All migrants have an economic dimension, and it's the economic dimension that's often the most political part of it. Now, I don't want to argue, of course, that nation states in the West do not have the capacity for more humanitarian migration. They do. They clearly have an economic and cultural capacity, but they clearly also do not have the political capacity to welcome populations, and this is a core problem of our democracy. Our democracy, literally, in order to maintain itself, is unable to recognize vast numbers of migrants as humanitarian migrants, and this is, I want to argue, a problem with democracy rather than a problem with migrants as such. But I also argue that asylum seeking itself is also a kind of selective process. It's selective by age, it's selective by often by education. If migrants have been persecuted, they may be political reasons for this. It's often selective in terms of capital. There is always a left behind population, and we might want to go into the full kind of argument for this, but we can't save everyone who might be designated as a forced migrant in this system simply by giving them a national passport, by giving them a British passport, for example, because there will always be left behind populations in this particular view of things. And of course, the maintenance of the sacred value of the passport, the nationality that migrants are meant to be accessing when we welcome them in as immigrants under these categories, is what maintains the value of the passports as a measure of the global inequality that is inherent in where people come from and the nationality that they're born with, the well-known birthright lottery argument about global inequalities. And so what I try to do is bring back in economic migration into the picture. I want to talk about migration as decolonization in terms of Tendai Achume's work. Yes, large-scale global migration would be the biggest redistribution that we could imagine to the order of global inequalities. But the key part about this is that the migration, for it to be transformative in terms of global inequalities, it must also drive down the value of the Western passports. The Western passports themselves have to be devalued by migration. And the migrants can only do this if they bring disintegrative politics. There has to be a disintegrative dynamic to the politics in order for it to be changing the order of the world that we live in some sense. I have an argument about how the subaltern in our world not only cannot speak, they also cannot move. And I spent a lot of time also in the latter part of the book critiquing rather progressive conceptions of interculturalism, or the compatibility of integration and transnationalism, because I think these do not put enough accent on the necessarily conflictual politics that migration has to throw up. Migrants have to, in some sense, be introducing a genuinely conflictual and disintegrative politics into our nation states in order for there to be effects. I suggest various ways in which this may be seen as a kind of disintegrative effect. There are new forms of class politics that would be associated with this. Migrants in solidarity with working class politics. There's the continued effect of informality, of the kind of anarchist consequences of migration against the nation state, as nation states disintegrate or fail to manage migration, or fail to impose integration on migration in an international world. And there's also various forms of resistance and mobilization that might be pointed to in terms of how migration leads to a conflictual politics breaking borders. And we can link this up with literatures such as the literature on citizenship acts, on autonomy of migration, and also work such as Chala and Glick-Schiller's recent work on mobilizations around politics in peripheral locations against the nation state. A lot of this obviously is very familiar. It harks back to the transnationalism of the 1990s, which is why it would be great to discuss with this panel this question. Transnationalism and post-nationalism of the 1990s imagined a lot of these things and saw a world that was transforming as a result of migration, transmigration as transformative. But of course it gets sucked into a particular kind of migration development dynamic which always wants to justify international migration in terms of a win-win-win. Win for the receiving state, win for the migrants, and win for sending states. And I basically want to argue in this book, no. Somebody has to lose out of international migration, and who has to lose is the receiving state, effectively, if we're ever going to see the kinds of transformation to global inequalities as a result of migration, whereas all of our migration politics and immigration politics generally is focused on justifying migration from the point of view of the receiving state. I think ultimately our models are progressive models of immigration are very much rooted in an idealization of North American society in which the most advanced West European societies are moving towards a kind of American immigrant integration model. And it's precisely this this particular vision and this particular effective American empire that I think we have to critique and move away from in our rethinking of immigration politics.
Thank you, Adrian. A lot of stuff to be discussed. I would like to start with talking about migration studies as it is, and your critique and the deficits of migration studies or its need for reorientation. Let me just wait a second until the screen is pulled back up. In your text that I could read in advance, well, people listening couldn't, you're a bit sharper and more provocative about the current situation of migration research. I've noted that I think you describe it as divided into three camps. There's one, the old progressive illusion, associated with post-national, the hope for a post-national membership and the transnationalizing of the world, but you say progressive illusions. There you have second, the new attack on pretty much everything. And third, the pragmatic acceptance of current opportunities in funding and doing affirmative integration research, etc. And I was wondering and would like to ask the two other panelists, well, Steve first, in this confrontation of complacent, confirmative, affirmative mainstream, utopian illusions, and new critical claims, where do you place your own work and that of this institute? Do you find yourself there?
Okay, thanks, Karen. Wasn't expecting that one. Because I want to get around it because there's so much in what Adrian's saying as ever that is really great and needs talking about. Okay, but to answer that question, I mean, this is where, I'm always saying to our staff here, I feel like the real grandpa in the room all the time because I'm talking about this kind of longue durée of career. And, according to Adrian's kind of classification, I'm definitely in that kind of, what was it, the progressive, hopeful kind of thing, progressive hopey. Because I was certainly a big part of that transnationalism paradigm shift, the cosmopolitanism and all that, and I'd like to come back to those sorts of issues. The sort of things, I mean, to bring it around to the Institute and our agenda now, I won't turn this into a kind of long kind of advert for us or something, but we were trying to, have been over the last 15 years, trying to change the agenda and not be about migration studies, to not find ourselves sucked into that immigration, integration, citizenship, linear trajectory that I totally agree does end up being what migration studies kind of buys into a lot of times, by looking at issues of social difference and diversity and how diversities of many kinds function or not, or bring about new conflicts, new negotiations, new hybridities, new modes of difference. And to try to create a different agenda. So of course we overlap with a lot of what migration studies has been doing for 30 years, but trying to change the agenda a little bit. So, in answer to your question, I definitely, just by kind of biographical terms, am part of that older generation, older paradigm of migration studies. But at the Institute here, I think not only have we been trying to change a paradigm, but we've been trying to create a new field that isn't just migration studies itself.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we come back to the question of what the progressive illusions are. I was wondering, to start with one, Christina, I was wondering whether this trajectory of immigration, integration, citizenship isn't the old progressive illusion, but the illusion of the 1950s and 60s, and whether, Christina, maybe you want to comment whether you think that this still shapes research as it is done in Germany and as you experience it at IMIS, one core center of German research in the field?
Yeah, well, actually maybe not so much, I have to say. So I found, what I found very interesting is, or kind of very convincing, is to see that migration studies have shifted, and there's a generational shift, which is also, of course, related to kind of shift in zeitgeist and in how global world order is perceived, from this globalization and optimistic narratives to then realizing that nation states and borders matter. And so it's not only, I think, I would only say, not say it's only a generational shift, it's also a shift like in like historical events, and this I find absolutely convincing, but I really didn't find, like the way I perceive migration studies in Germany and beyond, I didn't really find it back in your paper and on your descriptions. I don't really see this binary between old mainstream and new progressive decolonial. I think the field is much more plural, much more diverse. I also see, well, like these the migration studies that is only focused on immigration, integration, citizenship. That's maybe an old type of migration studies. Maybe, of course, some of these questions still matter. Citizenship is a big issue, but it has already been thought beyond this triad of like put it into immigration, integration, citizenship. There's a much progressive research going on. You also mentioned it, acts of citizenship, citizenship. So I think all kinds of, also like, just to take this as an example, I wouldn't locate this only in this triad of immigration, integration, citizenship. And when I think or look at the migration studies as it's practiced in Germany by German scholars, although I have a bit of a problem of kind of nationalizing then migration studies again and put it in the national container, because of course migration studies in Germany is also like connected to migration studies more globally. I think there has been a lot of dynamics in the past years, decades. The kind of migration studies I got to know has already been the migration studies beyond the criticism of methodological nationalism, which is also very strong in kind of your description of the mainstream. Of course, these criticisms are ongoing and we haven't overcome methodological nationalisms, but the critique is there. That's what is actually the core of migration studies as I know it. And there are many, like, also different approaches which go far beyond of looking migration as immigration, and of like a critique of the integration paradigm has been quite old in the German context as well. I think it's something that dates back to the 2000s, even before. So yeah, to say that I had a bit some difficulties to situate the migration studies that I know, and also I can do observe in Germany in these binaries that you described. Not saying that there is not new tendencies and especially decolonial, anti-racist approaches which are becoming stronger, but I also don't think that they are contradicting to necessarily, or like they are not in an opposition or juxtaposition to other kinds of approaches, not necessarily in that way.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I just want to pick up on one point or make a footnote to what Christine was saying about, again, the diversity of migration studies, and I'd be interested to get, Adrian's view on this. That, obviously we have to be very wary of kind of constructing and reifying migration studies as a thing. And actually, of course, migration studies is a multidisciplinary field. And, you've got geographers, anthropologists, political scientists, sociologists, others in cultural studies and so forth, all kind of, packing things in, but at the same time, many people are following the theoretical debates and developments of their own disciplines at the same time, and they only happen to meet in certain journals that we know are migration studies journals. And so it's always a tough thing, and especially then, to add a kind of periodization onto this spread of studies. Are we talking about anybody who publishes an article on migration, whether it's in GEMS or in American Journal of Sociology? Do we count them on board? Or it's a question, I raised this in an article last year too, what about people who would not consider themselves to be migration studies scholars? So, you know, I mean, Adrian, you mentioned, you know, people like Anthony Heath. I think he would be anathema to say, I'm not a migration studies scholar, but I have, some of my studies happen to involve migrants.
He's an integration scholar, yes.
Yeah. And so, well, it's
No,
an interesting
You say
thing.
so? You mean he's a general sociologist?
He's a
general
sociologist, he's a quantitative sociologist,
Yeah.
and some of his work happens to be about migrants. He does loads of things on education and class and all sorts of other things as well. So, you know, trying to talk about migration studies on the whole, although, as I say, I wanted to say this early on too, you know, it's a good thing we've called this series In Dialogue rather than Critical Debate or something, because, you know, as Adrian already said, I've got a blurb on the back of his new book. I'm applauding what he's saying. I'm in the same camp, as it were. So we're, you know.
But what
it's
is
two
that
people.
camp? That's what we're here
Yeah.
to find out.
Okay, fair enough, and then we've got a bit of time to explore that. But for now, and you know, just again drawing on the issues that Christina raised, you know, we have to be careful of what we're talking about as migration studies. Are we lumping too much in? Are we reifying something? And then, of course, there's that generational thing, and there's no doubt about it that there is the trend, the critical migration studies and critical race studies, you know, is a hot topic right now. But again, as you know, the oldie in the room and so forth, I mean, in the 80s and 90s, I mean, you mentioned Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, and you know, the book was at 1970s, The Empire Strikes Back. We had, you know, what would be called critical race studies and decolonial, you know, calls then as well. These aren't new inventions. It's every generation finds anew some of the same issues, and that's a problem. That even though different generations call upon the same issues, why haven't we been able to move that down the road?
Yeah.
Why do we have to return to some of these same issues?
Maybe we take that separately. Adrian, you want to comment on what migration research are we actually talking about? Where is that also maybe locally or nationally? Is that in fact not only English language migration research? Is that only the research that happens in the migration journals, or the research of anyone writing something about migration? So what constitutes that field?
Yeah, the paper that we're talking about obviously is written for one of the key journals, Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, which I would consider at the core of what we think of as migration research, migration studies. It's obviously not going to be a fully coherent field. I'm also thinking very clearly about something like IMIS. People who work within that framework, I think, know who they're thinking about in terms of migrants. Those migrants are usually immigrants. They're often not thinking that much about mobile populations. We're at the periphery of that and always have been, which is one point that I continually want to make. And there has been a shift, I think, the generational shift or the post-crisis shift has been a shift towards a much more critical view of immigration politics as producing, you know, racialized exclusions, deportability, and you know, aspects of you know, as particularly as I think the critical race kind of theory has come into the picture. I don't think it's so difficult to sort of have a sense of who that population of researchers is, in a sense, although I take the point that, of course, there are people studying migration outside of that, and in fact I have something to say in the paper also about the way in which migration has been problematically mainstreamed by a lot of other kinds of disciplines move into migration studies and reproduce even less critical kinds of work, because they often reproduce the immigration, integration, citizenship, linear stuff. But I think Christine's point is a point that cuts to the heart of what I'm trying to do with the integration nation. I'm a normative political theorist, and my bottom line point is that I think we completely underestimate the power of the nation state. We've had 20 years of debates about methodological nationalism, and yet methodological nationalism still structures policy-oriented immigration studies research everywhere. And it structures it particularly through the EU. The EU, I think, has been the biggest financer of research on integration in recent years, and there are countless numbers of products that are doing studies on integration that in the past would have been called studies on multiculturalism or studies on transnationalism or diasporic politics. Now they have to formulate it in terms of integration, and they have to show that it's contributing to a nation-building process of emergent, multi-ethnic, diverse nation-states within Europe that are managing their problems along the lines of what I argue is effectively a North American kind of model. Now, Germany obviously has always been the big counter-example of the wannabe post-national nation. It's, you know, at the heart of Europe, Germany dissolving itself into a European construction and fostering an idea that the nation-state is coming to an end, you know, the Habermasian sort of utopia about Germany. And yet, I don't think really that there's much beyond in progressive thinking in Germany beyond the idea that we're going to transform all of the immigrants into Germans at some point. I mean, I think what we're looking for in Germany, as we are in Britain and France, is a increasingly multi-ethnic, multiracial nation that is able to handle immigrants and transform foreigners into multi-ethnic, multiracial new citizens of the German nation state. Now, my problem with this, as a normative political theorist, is that this is how sovereignty is produced. This is exactly how sovereignty is produced in a multi-ethnic, multiracial state. And it's the production of citizens, in other words, is the production of sovereignty, and the production of sovereignty is the reproduction of national power in the world. And so it's exactly the opposite, in some sense, of what we were hoping for with transformative transnationalism or post-national membership and so forth, which was using things like, you know, human rights to imagine a different sort of world order. And I think over this 20-year period, we've gone drastically backwards in our imagining how international migrations, ongoing international migrations, might transform the global hierarchy of nationalisms that is implicit in our sustenance of what I call the North Atlantic West idea conceptions of citizenship. So my problem, I think, with a lot of the intercultural research that Christine is evoking, a lot of intercultural theorists are going to read my stuff and they say, but we're not doing that. We're focusing on the local. We're looking at very positive interactions between new migrant populations and locals. And I'm saying, well, no. I mean, as you continually reproduce this idea that there are positive progressive outcomes that can happen at the local level, you're sustaining the ongoing illusion of the integratory nation state on some level, because integration is always about the nation state ultimately. And this is there's a Luhmannian theoretical kind of idea at the heart of all of this, because it's all about the production of sovereignty, the production of governance on a national level, which is ultimately rooted in our liberal democratic ideas of individual citizenship and the distinction between nationals and aliens.
But let me, before I ask Christine about the local level and the chances we have there, I can't quite figure it out. On the one hand, you're saying that there's too much research, or most of research in our field thinks only in terms of integration processes happening within the nation state, and that's wrong. We should overcome that. Then maybe we should later on talk about, well, what could this look like, yeah? But on the other hand, you keep saying there is the all-powerful nation state, and you quite strongly emphasize that in your talk, too strongly, I personally think. But so isn't that a contradiction? If the nation state is determining everything, then wouldn't it be stupid not to study this role of the nation state? I mean, wouldn't that be another illusion or a misoriented research?
Well, I am studying the power of the nation state, yeah, and I'm studying how nation states continue to generate power through the management of diversity.
And that's not methodological nationalism. Populations.
Well, I think we have to start with the diagnosis of the nation state if we're going to have any methodological denationalism. I mean, I don't think my position is very different to Bridget Anderson's, for example, on this. I mean, it's a similar sort of analysis. It's about how good and bad migrations are produced, how us and them is continually reproduced through our policy modes of thinking about particular sorts of migrant and mobile populations that we identify as immigrants, and also how we I'm also extending this to the ways in which nation states identify ethnic and racial minorities in the book, which also is heavily embedded in particular sorts of national modes of governing diversity.
Yeah.
So I'm studying power in that sense, and the power of the nation state, and I'm saying we've underestimated, the extent to which we've really been able to produce work that is methodologically denationalizing in its implications. I think mainly because there is this continual attempt to try and transform something that ought to be about conflictual and resistant politics into something that is more consensual and integratory in a certain sense. So there's an old sense in which I'm going back to the old social theory debates about consensus theories versus conflict theories, and what it would mean to have a kind of conflictual politics in this context. And that's where, of course, that's where Hall and Gilroy are, back and highly relevant. Black Lives Matter is a conflictual politics. It's a politics about decolonizing the world that we live in, and it's about pulling down the statues of the nation state. It's very much about contesting, national histories, national self-conceptions, and the very insidious way in which national self-conceptions actually are at their most powerful when they rebrand themselves as multi-ethnic and multiracial. And maybe, one of the things I think that could be put to me is that a lot of my work has been overly determined by what has happened in British politics over the last few years. And at the heart of the book, obviously, there are things like the Windrush scandal and the fate of EU citizens in Britain, because I think these are extremely good examples of how, which reveal very much the workings of the integration nation, and the way in which a particular sort of immigration narrative has been imposed on these kinds of issues in order to counter the actual denationalizing implications of post-colonial politics in Britain or the presence of EU nationals in Britain. And I could go into those details if you wish. But I also think it's a story about the assimilation, the self-assimilation of West European nation states to a North American model, which I think is absolutely pervasive in our immigration studies. And I also think is pervasive in a lot of the highest level comparative research that we have to hand. So this is why, I would focus on what a lot of the quantitative researchers are doing, for example, in trying to build US-European comparative models that effectively are about North American models.
Maybe let first Christine comment on what you said. You were a bit dismissive, I should say, about the urban local studies, and this is pretty much a fashion, I think, in migration, integration research nowadays, or has been for a long time, and is often presented as an alternative to a nation-state-focused research. And you say it's just reproducing that bias. Christina, would you agree?
Refugees, just to give people an idea of what we're talking about, the very strong trends in refugee studies that are focused on integration in the light of Agar and Strang's model on local integration, which continues to be very pervasive amongst refugees.
What model?
Agar and Strang's model of refugee integration, that is the standard model for local integration research on refugees.
Okay, Christina, how do you see that, the role of local studies?
Just very different things now. I wanted to also comment on something different. So maybe, going back to first the local question. Yeah, that's, you're also doing, what I just learned, research or comparative research on localities, on cities, and which is often then the idea of going beyond this, overcoming methodological nationalism and looking at cities. And so what I think it's definitely an important approach to look at different kinds of kind of specialities, spatial units. On the other hand, we could also say, and that we still see the nation state coming in quite a lot, especially when you do comparative research across cities in different countries. We see that a lot is shaped also by the nation state, what's going on in the city by the national scale, by national politics. And then something that made me think quite a lot in your paper, and which I find quite maybe we should also question when we're doing research on cities, on city policies, and from what I understood, what you mean by like this power of the nation state is also that in defining the way we as migration scholars ask questions, what kind of topics we're interested in, and which also concerns research that we are doing on cities. So if we look at how cities becoming more inclusive, for example, to migrants, and how more accommodate diversity better or less or worse, this is, from what I understood, what you mean is also how our questions and our topics are shaped by this idea of a national integration, that kind of a nation-state integration to form a society which is kind of well integrated in terms of if we say integration not as something that pertains to individual migrants, but equality of society in a Durkheimian sense, as you understand integration. So this is something that I found interesting also for us to question when we're doing research on cities, and how much our questions actually are shaped by a nation-state paradigm. But what I also meant in looking at current migration research is not only that we look at different kind of topics or different kinds of localities, for example, but also that there are different approaches, which at least in the German context and also my institute are becoming quite, I would say, common sense already, that we look not at migration or migrants as something that is given, but something that's constructed, is produced by different types of actors on different scales. In terms of also nation state very powerful in categorizing and defining who is a migrant or not. What you also what I think it's already become common sense in the types of migration studies that I'm doing. Also migration regimes as a concept that has been developed in my institute, or how migration is produced, the meaning of migration is produced. So, and while I think this is it's not a marginal part of migration studies anymore, I also see, and that, or maybe also referring to what you just mentioned in terms of funding, that one challenge for migration studies is to ask questions and to think in terms of topics that are not shaped by, or more or less subtly shaped by national nation-state paradigms and interests. And what we see, for example, also in German migration studies, is there has been a lot of funding for refugee studies post 2015. Now we have quite a lot of projects that are run on racism, state-funded projects on racism, when both, of course, are very interesting, very important topics for research. But this is something that you made me think when I read your paper, that how should we deal with the national state funded project on racism? Do we also have to consider this as a part of an integration nation that now has to deal with this topic, challenge, problem, risk of racism? In order to not fall apart, we have to kind of fund research for that, find solution for that. Is this the same kind of just put in a different box or a different layer and a different label on it? Now we're studying racism, we're not studying integration anymore, but would you consider this to be the same kind of research that we are doing then as migration scholars?
I mean, I think there'll be the same dangers, the same governmental effects that I'm trying to analyse going on in Germany as we've seen in other countries. And Germany's, of course, gone through a very rapid transformative kind of period in terms of moving towards a more multi-ethnic conception of itself. I would say that migration researchers, in the face of the overwhelming centrality of national visions of immigration, have often retreated to the local level, and they're looking for the positive things at the local level. They're trying to influence local politics, which they may do. I think what perhaps I give in the book is not, what I'm not absolutely not trying to do is prevent or even critique a lot of what people are doing at the local levels. What I'm arguing for is a a much stronger awareness and self-consciousness about the dangers of buying into some of these kind of integration and citizenship type languages in describing some of the things that are going on. And I think we need to look for the, disintegrative aspects of local immigration politics at the national level, and disintegrative in terms of the global order, rather than sort of seeing this as a way in which these things are kind of assisting the nation state in transforming itself into something new. Otherwise, there's no effect on, there are no effects on global inequalities effectively. So, what we used to describe in terms of, certain forms of multiculturalism and transnationalism were about emptying out the nation state, hollowing out the nation state. Diasporic politics were about challenging national orders, the national order of things. Multiculturalism in those senses was often quite transformative, but multiculturalism can go the other way. It can be absorbed into a new kind of nationalist discourse quite effectively, and this is, we've seen this happen with a lot of the theory around multiculturalism. I think interculturalism has some of the same problems. I mean, it's a new way of branding the tolerant, inclusive, diverse nation and its ability to select certain sorts of immigrants, leave lots of other immigrants out of the picture, and just take a few and rebrand itself around these kinds of success stories. So that's the sort of dynamic I'm trying to get at, and I think the book maybe gives a certain sort of line in the sand, as it were, that intercultural theorists, readers can sort of say, well, am I doing this or am I doing this? I can, what am I contributing to? And that's why I sort of said, Challa and Glick-Schiller's work is very explicitly anti-integrationist. It's very explicitly about mobilizations and about scalar politics that is disintegrative, I think, and that I think is, that's one of the examples I give of a work that I think has moved things forward in a way that is consistent with an older transnationalism agenda. I think transnationalism also went through a transformation. It was transformative. It was about transmigration, and then it all became about how transnationalism was going to assist integration. And the second generation transnationalism kind of gets caught up in a kind of integration logic, I think, which the other thing we've not talked about, which I think needs to be made explicit, is of course the real problems with transnationalism and postnationalism in the 1990s is that they're also intimately bound up with neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is also intimately bound up with neocolonialism, and we've got to kind of think about ways in which we can kind of distinguish between the genuinely kind of transformative dimensions of these modes of thought and the ways in which they've actually assisted the ongoing reproduction of a certain sort of racial capitalism, effectively, that is based on the multi-ethnic, potentially super diverse modern nation state that is able to deal with the challenge of immigration.
Steve, you wanted to come in. Maybe you also say to what extent you would want to do disintegrative research.
Okay, I'll park that question if we've got time for that. No, I wanted to raise two things, and one of them you've touched on already. That is, Adrian, in both the GEMS paper that we're talking about, and people can look for that forthcoming in the journal, and in the book, which we'll do a plug, so buy the book. You seem to kind of blow hot and cold on transnationalism. And you just now kind of did the same thing, and I could kind of follow, because I would say that yes, that transnational moment of the late 90s, early 2000s, the whole purpose of the paradigm shift, and I explicit in calling it that, I think it changed migration studies, was the methodological nationalism thing. I mean, Glick, Schiller, and Wimmer published that in our journal, Global Networks. As a it's all about transnationalism. It's all the challenge to the integration nation state. People can be in more places at once, politically, socially, economically. It's breaking down barriers. And so that really was a disruptive moment in the way we thought about nation states and about migration and so forth. And I mean, we'll have to turn this into another seminar because it's too much to go into now. I'm not quite sure what you mean about the neoliberalism thing around transnationalism. I'm a bit skeptical of that. It was happening at the same time as all the hubbub about globalization, which was definitely a neoliberalism thing, but I don't think they're quite the same because, well, as we heard a lot at that time, people were saying, well, transnationalism itself isn't a new thing like globalization was. You can trace transnationalism back to the Romans, et cetera. So anyways, so I just, would be interested to hear more, if we've got time, about transnationalism. Because again, even in just this paper, you laud transnationalism as a disruptive moment, but you also say it's got problems because it got sucked into the integration nation sort of thing. And I'm kind of thinking, well, did it? I don't remember that happening, but it probably happens in some of the literature. So we could discuss transnationalism at length. The other thing, though, I wanted to raise while we've got time, before we have questions and comments, is something that I would ask you to think about maybe out loud now that you don't go into so much in the book. In the book, it's about painting that kind of narrative or logic of immigration leads to integration, leads to citizenship, and this is essentially a nation-state bordering model that we carry in our heads, sort of like the methodological nationalism, and I'm mostly on board with that. But I think it doesn't take on board, but I think it can, a huge part of migration that I think hasn't gotten as much attention, and that is the fact that migrants who come to a country, whether as asylum seekers or whatever, isn't just a matter of deportation or acceptance, and then you're on this linear track. The fact is that increasingly over the past 20 years, globally, you've had a massive proliferation of legal statuses and migration channels across everything from students to circular migration schemes, to seasonal workers, to high-skilled computer people, to corporate people, et cetera, and all in between, including the Eurostars that you've written about. And I really am influenced by people like Lydia Morris, and before that Eleanor Kaufman, who described this as civil stratification. That is, that so many migrants, from the moment they arrive in whatever destination, are assigned a legal status, and that in itself is positioning them in a system of social stratification, instantly limiting how long they can stay, where they can live, what kind of jobs, can they have families or not, do they need to go back, are they tied to their employer, do they get public largesse, et cetera, et cetera. It's a massive social structure. And the idea of the integration nation, you see what I'm getting at. I think that stratification scheme is still part and parcel of the integration nation, but simply to talk about the linear narrative of immigration, integration, citizenship doesn't do justice to that complexity of all the other stuff going on by way of stratifications, which themselves, of course, are highly racialized as well. What legal status you get, where you come from, and where you are placed in the system has a lot to do with where you come from, who you are, what you look like, and so forth. So I don't know if you could address that
Yeah, that's
issue.
very helpful, because I mean, I go along with this vision of the potential transformative transnational effects of these intermediate forms of mobilities. I mean, that's at the core of my argument. But we need criteria, of course, to talk about when those things lead towards more forms of racialized stratification and when they don't, in some ways. And I mean, the sort of glib answer to this is that this is the project I'm doing at Vico, is that there needs to be another work behind the integration nation to kind of systematically reassess, I think, the the effects of multiple statuses in migration. And
Exactly.
I mean, a lot of this has also come from outside of Europe. So there's all of the sort of new forms of migration mobilities being thrown up in the East Asian migration systems that have been identified as these sources. Now, I think they can be viewed both ways. You know, they can be viewed potentially as still transformative of a certain global order, or they can be seen as reinforcing the powers of you know, Eurocentric Western integration nation type formations as we have them. But I do think, you know, that there needs to be a restated case in some sense for some aspects of the transnational and post-national literature. But I do think we have to come, you know, squarely to grips with the fact that those potentialities as they were identified in the 1990s were very much bound up with neoliberal globalization and have been largely discredited and ignored by the later generations of migrant scholars who are simply not, you know, they're simply writing in a different sort of register, I think, about migration. You know, nobody would think of the transformative potential of the Eurostars anymore. I mean, that's a kind of... But I think there are issues around the status of EU citizens and the attempt to create a post-national membership that do point in a particular sort of direction. But, you know, it's got to be about the global effects. It's got to be related to the whole argument about global inequalities and birthright. So I'm trying to I think I'm sketching out a particular sort of agenda that is precisely balanced in this tension that you're identifying, and that's the hot and cold thing that you're talking about. And you know, I think that you know, that there is an ongoing sense in which I'm part of the transnational and post-national school and so on. So, but I do think we have to be vigilant about these, you know, the new forms of progressive immigration studies that are continually being generated by the field, that are very much driven, I think, by, you know, the attempts. As I said, it's very much about the way in which research gets structured by particular kinds of governmental ambitions, and you can kind of trace that in the way in which the EU has, you know, developed this kind of immigration integration agenda and all the funding that's followed from that, as countries like Germany have tried to come to terms with the refugee crisis. And there's, you know, just this inherent danger, I think, in the kind of celebratory style of that sort of research that is very difficult to square when you look at, you know, the hardcore kind of critical migration studies literature, which is I think very rightly emphasizing the, you know, the necropolitics, the other side of our positive kind of reimagining of multicultural societies. I mean, the necropolitics being the waste populations that are always getting left out and left behind.
Surely not only people who call themselves critical migration scholars do that. I mean, quite a number of us do. I was just looking around, seeing we have this younger generation here as well.
Yeah. Interesting to know, sample what
someone
people
wants
are reading.
to come in with a question or comment also.
You know, I'm talking about the work of Nick de Geneva, or the work that you can see summarized in Mablin and Turner's Migration Studies and Colonialism.
Yeah, not so young, or all of that, and very European centered, actually US centered, right? There may be others, but I'm the moderator.
The problem with that literature as well.
Yeah, absolutely, that's another issue to go into.
Yeah, Adrian? Adrian, sorry, I keep getting confused about Adrian.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to listen to your talk, and having read your work throughout the years and listening to the conversation today. How many questions I get to ask?
One.
Oh, no. Please be less, more generous. So I want a bit of clarification, and I have a couple of questions. So in the beginning, you mentioned that this generational gap between the Zollberg and more new Weberian approach, and then the more recent, maybe more Marxist and Foucaultian approach. And then my understanding was that you put yourself within the first camp, but it seems to me that you're actually defending or promoting that the second idea of more Marxist and Foucaultian disintegrative approach. So, like, how does that work? I just want, because I see myself as the younger generation, but then I see myself belonging to that first camp.
Yeah. No, it's,
If we have these camps at all. it's
Yeah,
still a little question, I would
exactly.
say.
So I want to see,
this one quickly maybe. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, let me just, because I...
okay, so I
should have said that this is Adrian Karimi, who is currently a Humboldt Fellow at our institute.
Right.
Yeah.
do I get to ask the questions, or you want to?
Well, I do. What I'm trying to do is obviously take very seriously the new wave of work that I think is rooted very much in Agamben's work and in,
Right.
in the kind of Italian autonomist thinking generally. But I do think that there's a absolute compatibility with aspects of the neo-Weberian older work, which was rooted in Zollberg's work, and it is reflected very clearly in the work of Brubaker and Holyfield when they're understood correctly, which is about how nation states produce national populations, affect nationalized populations, and reconcile it with a global political economy. And if you look at Holyfield's work on the migration state, I mean, it lines up very well, I think, with this, as long as you read it through a kind of critical lens, which is, informed, I think, by a particular sort of Marxist Foucauldian idea about the dangers of liberal democratic conceptions of citizenship in reproducing global inequalities.
Thank you. Then that means that I will have to go back reread some of the works. So you also talks about this North American economic approach to cherry picking certain migrants with the expectation that they are going to be future potential citizens, right?
Yeah.
And you say you labeled that as the North American model, and saying that Western Europeans are actually going towards that model as well, right?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what is the alternative model? Like, what is this other model that's, I mean, you didn't mention, and I don't know what that is.
Well, what alternative is there to the American dream, is the other word, or empire, Heart and Negri's empire that we all live in. I mean, that's the challenge, obviously. I am saying, I'm putting a fairly clearly Marxist proposition back on the table. There is an alternative to global liberal capitalism. That I think we need to take seriously as a proposition, and I do think we need to take seriously the proposition that migration, international migration, can contribute to that sort of conflictual politics in a way.
Sure. Okay. My last question
Let
goes
let
directly.
someone else come in first. Farhan has
Sure.
questions from the chat, I think. This is Farhan Samanani from the Institute reading out contributors' questions, yeah?
So we've got quite a few, and I'm going to, apologies to those in the audience, because I'm going to be a little bit selective, and I'm going to try to summarize as well, because some of them are a little bit long. Should I maybe give you 2 or 3 together?
We can read the questions later.
So I think one interesting question is around the sort of the spatial relationship between biopolitical governmentality and necropolitics. And Jeremy, who's asking the question, says, often the sort of necropolitical aspect of migration regimes plays out in certain spaces, border spaces, for instance, whereas the sort of biopolitical integrationist stuff is often quite metropolitan and so on.
Yeah.
And so then the question becomes, does the biopolitical governmentality of integration necessarily sort of presuppose a necropolitical regime somewhere else, a kind of counterpart? And what does that say of sort of the liberal status of liberal democracy as it is?
I mean, that would be a very good one way of reading what I'm saying, I think. I mean, or reformulating what I'm saying in terms that are perhaps are kind of more centrally anchored in this current new literature. I do think that's the point. Yeah, the point is there is a relationship between the necropolitics of the border and the biopolitics of producing citizens. That's central to the story. The dimension that's perhaps unusual or less focused on in the critical migration studies is that I'm also interested in the production of all these invisible mobile populations that are the Eurostars or the tourists or and bringing those back into the picture is important, because the fantastic things, and there's one thing we haven't talked about which we must talk about, which is COVID, but the fantastic thing about our, the liberal democratic North Atlantic West societies that we live in is that they're able to sustain this immigration integration model with incredible numbers of mobile populations across their borders every day. So we're talking about, times of non-COVID, 35 million people entering the UK in 1 year, at the same time as the nation is obsessed, absolutely obsessed with 300,000 immigrants that show up on immigration, and actually 35,000 asylum seekers, and 35 that get in on a boat across the channel or something. And that is an amazing fact. That's an amazing fact of the societies we live in. We live in absolutely porous, mobile societies, and yet we've got this obsessive immigration politics focused on the symbolic reproduction of the nation state by the transformation of 300,000 immigrants into good British citizens or something, where all this other stuff is going on. I did want to say something about COVID, which I think needs to be out there, if I may.
Have a few more questions before we do this.
If we have
maybe
time for
the end.
my 1, 2, 3 on COVID.
Do say who asks the question?
Sure. So that first one was, as I said, from Jeremy, and then Helena and Sabrina have two kind of nicely related ones. So I'm just going to put those together. Helena's asking, if we accept the idea that there must be a loser in your argument, the receiving state, then what does this mean for both migration studies, so some of the implications for where we go next, and for states supporting the idea of accepting migrants? So I guess for migration policy, in public policy. And then Sabrina, relatedly, is asking, would it be possible to talk more about the idea that we have to start with an analysis of the nation state to create work that is denationalizing?
Right. I'm obviously I'm moving towards a position where I think it's very difficult to see what policymakers might want to do with this kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not about policymakers; it's about politics, about migration politics as something a lot more conflictual and contestatory than we're prepared to imagine it. And I'm also, sort of saying that we, as migration studies scholars, we need to continually think about this relationship and problematize it because of the way in which funding and coming up with constructive policy-related research, which itself, again, is another feature of the neoliberal era that we've lived through, neoliberal governance kind of models. Denationalizing research is going to have to focus on this kind of, on alternate politics, I think. I think I'm also moving towards a very skeptical position of the capacity of our current liberal democracies to really come up with solutions to these sorts of issues. I think that is one of the implications of what I'm saying.
Right. And then if I can get in one more from the audience online. So you mentioned the sort of left behind in terms of those who do not migrate or not able to. And Annette is asking about what about those who are sort of left behind or labeled as left behind within sort of receiving nations, and the sort of renationalization or the sort of neo-nationalism movements that emerge in relation to that.
Yeah.
And what challenges does this pose to sort of either moving beyond the national frame and to denationalizing migration studies?
Yeah, so an alternate politics obviously would imagine that there might be common interests of the left behind national populations, the so-called left behind national populations, and marginal migrant populations that are living amongst them, and that's and it's that sort of mobilization that some scholars have been starting to kind of look at this. This is Challa and Glickschiller's kind of argument. What's of course interesting is the way in which the symbolic politics of the left behind, so-called white working class populations and so forth around Western Europe, have been mobilized as at the same time as they are the least integrated people in Western societies. They're mobilized as the core of the integration nation, politically and symbolically, and that has been the great kind of success story of Boris Johnson in the UK. Has been this ability to kind of project integration on these people as the core of the nation, at the same time as they are, in fact, highly marginalised. The polarisation, marginalisation, and disadvantage of these populations is real in relation to the inequalities that exist in our societies. And so there's this this very nasty irony in the way in which neo-nationalism has been able to mobilise those populations. And I suppose one of the big key arguments I always make is that whenever there's this kind of integration argument going on, it's being used by certain people in order to justify the fact that they are not integrated, or they have a different kind of integration, which is a free-moving, global, modern citizen type of integration. So the integration of the elite is not a national integration. They don't have to prove anything about their national belonging, whereas we project all of the belonging onto immigrants and onto disadvantaged working class populations, sustaining a particular sort of model of democracy and so forth. And that's again one of the great paradoxes and ironies of the neoliberal era, is how it's been able to sustain this particular sort of illusionary structure, as it were, that I think is at the heart of neo-nationalism and as a project.
Great.
Right. You wanted to turn to COVID.
Well, yeah, I do think it's worth mentioning, because a lot of what I write in The Integration Nation is pre-COVID, in the sense, and I think it will be post-COVID, as I think we will go back to these kind of immigration integration models. I think the future is multi-ethnic and multiracial, and I mean that's one of the things I'm saying that perhaps counters some of the trends that we're stuck in. But it's not less nationalised. It's going to be renationalised and it's all about national rebranding. Germany's going through it. Britain and France have long experience of this, the way they celebrate themselves. And there's no future, I think, for this kind of narrow ethno-cultural nationalism. I mean, I think this is a blip, in a sense, towards a future that will be very multi-ethnic. It will be post-racial, or it will try to conceive itself as post-racial, and it sees itself as, I think the North American model is very instructive, because what makes it possible to imagine the USA as a kind of image of the post-racial, multi-ethnic immigrant nation is, of course, the fact that it also involves the wipeout of an indigenous population, settler colonialism, the forgetting of a particular sort of racial colour line that structures citizenship in the society, and the transformation of race into ethnicity, which is at the core of the post-racial kind of argument. And I think Europeans, my argument is West European societies are kind of moving in that sort of direction, which is a kind of combination of Canada and the US in some ways. COVID, what has COVID done? COVID has of course shown that the nation state never went away. So Saskia Sassen was wrong. Renationalisation, there was never really a convincing denationalisation. Renationalisation is back. The nation state is back in its visible powers, because the disease has been nationalised. We're constrained within national constructions and fictions of public health. The borders obviously have come straight back in. We have eugenic conceptions of population almost re-emerging. That's obviously obvious points in a sense. COVID also, of course, has had all these differential effects that everyone has noticed. So it's racialized and classed within nations, and it's narrowed the golden mobility pathways for elites. So it's that whatever was expanding towards the middle classes is narrowed again. So again, I think COVID actually helps us see the integration nation a lot more clearly. We were never going towards a post-integration society in a very convincing way, and now it's really back. The nation state is the unit. But the other thing about COVID, of course, is that the disease, at the end of the day, does not respect the integrity of bodies or of borders or of global privilege. I mean, the one thing about diseases is that they are post-national, transnational, post-national, denational, and transformative in that sort of sense. And it has, of course, exposed, it was interesting, at least in the early phases of COVID, how it most homed in on the neoliberal freedoms of mobile capitalism. So it was the mobile corporate conference attendees who all get COVID first, or the politicians or whatever. But of course, it got rapidly nationalised after that. So I use COVID in the book. There's a kind of postscript in the book about COVID that this is, again, traces it in ways that I think have been also mapped out very nicely by Janine de Hinden and Bridget Anderson. But it really helps us shift towards a potential sort of planetary thinking, because it reveals it reveals really how the integration that we've imagined all along was a human integration. It was a human societal integration, and not one that, and the alien or whatever, the alien beyond the integration, that the thing that's out, the differentiation in some sense of global society was always the non-human, or the post-human. I think there are ways in which problematizing integration again in this way kind of helps us also bring in some interesting sort of aspects of the new kind of post-human thinking on planetary futures, as opposed to human futures for national societies.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that, Christine? Steve? What about the future of migration? Are we going to see very little migration and a very effectively controlling migration state? And maybe to Adrian, where does this leave your initial promise of the migrants as the force of change? I mean, now suddenly the nation state's back in control. But let the others, maybe you have... Sure. Comments on the implications of COVID? Will that stay and have brought in the nation state, or revive the nation state as controlling movement, and all the integration trends are over?
I'm not so sure whether I should really give my prospects for the future. I would rather ask, maybe also related to what you just said, a question again to you, because maybe like. Because you end in your paper, we also mentioned here, kind of optimistically, that if we look at the transforming power of migrants and these alternative perspectives, politics, this might somehow change our global order shaped by nation states. And I wondered whether, is this now your kind of a synthesis coming, you came from this classical migration studies, maybe optimistic, or there might be a post-national world order, now realizing that the way it has been conceived by kind of, in a way, international institutions, kind of still in this nation state paradigms, hasn't led to anything, and it's still like keeping up these nation state paradigms, and is now your solution, your kind of your hope lying now in migrants or mobile people's forces to change the nation-state order? Did I get this correctly? And then I wondered whether, although I'm very sympathetic to these ideas, also the idea of autonomy of migration and looking at migrants' agency, whether this does not also risk instrumentalizing mobile people who might just seek for a better future for themselves and their children, for the own political project, to overcome a world order which is shaped by global inequalities, by post-colonial power structures that we ourselves do not manage to overcome with our politics.
Well, I mean, it's an argument about necessary politicization of these issues. Without politicization, there's not going to be any mobilization that's effective. I mean, I think, the book moves in a direction that's not particularly surprising or unusual. It tries to kind of make links between migration politics, Black Lives Matters, environmental movements, and extinction movements and so forth. I mean, I think these have been very interesting and inspiring transnational movements that have emerged in this same crisis period, in a way maybe that was not anticipated in quite, in some of the older forms of transnationalism. I don't know. We need to look closely at this kind of aspect. It shouldn't be just about projecting change onto migration, onto migrants. And I think the implications I think of the argument are rather you know, are still very much about on looking at how migration affects sending countries. I mean, we've got to go back to the relationship of migration to sending countries and see who else is involved in the migration who's not a mobile or migrant population, and see to what extent that is a source of alternate power that is drawing things away from the receiving state side of the equation in some ways. So I think that there's resources going back into some of the older political transnationalism type arguments about diasporic politics, and about linking these various things together. I mean, I'd recommend there's a really fantastic article by Anne McNevin on this, which is, I think, very similar. Again, I cite it in the book. It's a similar sort of argument about rethinking the standardized forms of time and space that structure migration studies, and the inability of migration studies to kind of connect with these other forms of social movement and mobilization and so forth that kind of get us out of the kind of national politics. So I mean, I think there's lots of resources in the current critical literature, and a lot of writers who are turning around these things. And I'm kind of coming at that literature, trying to contribute something to it, and also saying that that there's ways in which this is also very much consistent with the kind of framework for migration studies that Ari Zolberg established in his work, and which is very well reflected in his work on U.S. immigration, which is absolutely about the history of American immigration as a production of a racialized population, a selective, extractive, colonial kind of vision of the U.S. as an empire that has drawn its strength out of international migration principally, and which I argue, I think West European states are also moving in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Steve, on
COVID? Just first, last thoughts coming to mind. Ari Zolberg was a wonderful man. Read everything you can by Ari Zolberg.
Can I mention one other name? The other key author that really structures what I'm saying is Abdelmalek Sayed's work, and it's all in Abdelmalek Sayed. I think the argument about the integration nation is there. It's just I think that's the other kind of foundation work.
I just wanted to quickly, as we come to an end, address the COVID and what does the future hold for us, for migration. I completely agree with everything you're saying about COVID, and it's interesting that there was all the rhetoric on all scales and all quarters, about how the virus respects no borders and everything. But what was the first thing nation states did? Fortify the borders, close the borders. We'll sort this out as Germany, as Belgium, as Netherlands, and so forth. And mobility became the problem.
Yeah.
And so moving on from that, I think kind of a future, I've been involved in this in different ways through articles and other debates, because an ex-student of mine, Alan Gamlin, who's also a postdoc here, now just got a professorship at Australian National University, wrote a piece, which is published a couple of different places, called The End of Migration, ? Where he's actually thinking that the age of migration, as defined by Stephen Castles and others, is coming to an end. And COVID is just another nail in the coffin. And I really disagree with that for all sorts of reasons. But I think major transformations are going to happen. And just as a closing thing, I'd be really interested to get Adrian's view while we got him on this scenario. Relates to a piece I wrote called Singapore Futures, and that's what I think the future holds for migration. I think more and more countries around the world are going to look like Singapore, in that Singapore absolutely relies on a kind of underclass of global migrant labor force, unskilled and medium-skilled labor force that they give temporary visas to, house separately from the national population, screen for diseases, and easily get rid of when their contracts run out. And I think that's what a lot of future is going to look like, except in places, importantly, like in Africa, where Africa's actually, many African states are moving towards open borders as national policies. But other states, particularly in the north and the west, I think are going to, in the future, look more like Singapore. And that could start spelling the end of the immigration, integration, citizenship trajectory, because I think citizenship is going to be far, far more rarely offered as a possibility for migrants. I think you're going to see a lot more circular schemes and temporary migration schemes to take care of all of the hugely important pending labor needs of the West and the North, and citizenship as that holy grail at the end of it is going to be rarely available for people. The big question for me also then is, the big issue is climate change. And I think we have to start unpacking the notion of migration and start thinking more and more about displacement. The future is going to be about people being displaced. And what happens to displaced people? Where do they go? Because other places are not going to be livable places to live. And so how this gets turned into migration studies, there's a massive literature and numerous conferences on migration and climate change. So, you know, this is a huge issue of attention, but maybe we need to start rethinking what we normally think of as these processes and trajectories and so forth of migration, and think more and more about displaced peoples and moving across borders and what this means for nation-state models and integration machines, basically. So I don't know.
Maybe Steve, as we have run out of time, we take this as a suggestion for 2 further debates we should have then about political possibilities of the final success of the guest worker model was one, and the second, climate change and implications for migration and migration research. And is there new challenges to migration research, or are we well equipped with the tools we have to handle such challenges? And I think we should, think about how we can offer interesting debates in our series on such topics. And for today, thank Adrian for opening up all those questions and starting us off into a very interesting debate. And thanks to Christine Lang and Steve Vertovec again for contributing to this debate.
And Karen Schönwälder for chairing it so expertly.
And I hope to see you all again in here and out there as contributors to our series, and we try to offer you something interesting and worthwhile. Bye-bye for today.